Thank you for joining us on our first panel of the forum on sickle cell disease. I'd like to introduce you to our four panelists. The first is Dr. Nihara, MD, MPH. Dr. Nihara is the CEO and co-founder of Amos Life Sciences, principal investigator for LA Biomed at Harvard UCLA Medical Center, and clinical professor of medicine at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Dr. Nihara has been involved in patient care and research for sickle cell for most of his career. He is the founder of Amos Life Sciences and the principal inventor of Indari, an L-glutamine therapy for treatment of sickle cell disease, approved by the FDA in July of 2017. Our second panelist is Dr. Susan Perrin, MD. Dr. Perrin is a pediatric hematologist specializing in sickle cell disease, hemoglobinopathies, and viral-associated malignancies. She is president and chief medical officer for Phoenicia Biosciences and professor of pharmacology and experimental therapeutics at Boston University and School of Medicine. She serves on review panels for the U.S. National Institute of Health, NIH, and FDA Office of Orphan Product Development, and formerly on the NIH Advisory Board for Sickle Cell Disease. She has conducted epidemiologic, basic science, and clinical trial research in 7 global regions and directs an international trial in collaboration with the NIH. Our third panelist is Dr. Goetzman, MD. She is a pediatric hematology oncology specialist and assistant clinical professor at David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA and a director of the Pediatric Sickle Cell Specialty Care Center at Harvard UCLA Medical Center. She is also founder and medical director of Harvard UCLA Medical Center Adult Multidisciplinary Sickle Cell Disease Clinic. She has over 12 years of experience in the medical field and is committed to serving the most underserved patients in South Los Angeles. And our last panelist, Dr. Bronte Hall, MD, MPH. Dr. Bronte Hall is currently president and CEO of the Foundation for Sickle Cell Disease Research, chief health officer of the Sickle Care and Research Network, an independent full-service outpatient medical treatment and clinical trial center that offers medical care and coordinated care for underserved populations. She's a leading national and international researcher and population health scientist in the field of sickle cell disease, rare blood disorders, community-based participatory research, and chronic disease management. So thank you all for joining. So get into it. There are about 10,000 rare diseases in the world, and only a few see significant investments in research and development. Most will see no pharmaceutical potential at all, given the cost involved in taking a drug through the regulatory approvals. Yet, even diseases with significant market potential, significant research, and a dire need seem to be ignored by investors. Sickle cell disorder, one such disease, continues to be a killer affliction around the world. While a rare disease in the United States and Northern Europe, there are some 300 to 500 million people with sickle cell trait, which is the recessive carrier, and over 50 million with sickle cell disorder who suffer globally. I'll start with Dr. Perrin. So there are roughly 100,000 people with sickle cell in the US, another 100,000 in Europe. There are over 2 million in Africa, 20 million in Africa, over 20 million in India, and sprinkled throughout the Middle East. So in countries with high prevalence, is there a role for government, and what is the role of NGOs and the World Health Organization to facilitate treatment?
Hello, thank you. There certainly is a role for government, and there has been a very major role played by the National Institutes of Health and the Medical Research Council in the UK in developing the therapeutics that we have today, because there are 4 therapeutics which have reached the clinic and been approved, underwent years of testing, and the approaches underwent more than 20 to 30 years of testing by university investigators before they were developed in the clinic. So the role of government is extremely important. The role of government in delivering care, making care known to available to patients and giving them access is certainly a role of health services that only the governments can provide. And the role of WHO and private industry in supporting efforts to bring these therapies to patients is extremely important today. I might say that I think one of the countries that does this the best is in France, because they have centers of excellence for all rare diseases. They deliver, and then secondary centers in which clear guidelines for treating the patients are made known to medical centers that have fewer patients. So they do have 10 to 20,000 patients in a localized region around Paris, but they do a very good job, and we should be following their example.
Thank you. So Dr. Nihara, you have founded a treatment for sickle cell, Endari, which has minimal side effects. It's approved and paid for by insurance, but it still struggled to gain traction. Even now, when patients show up in the emergency room, a lot of times clinicians are not aware, they do not believe that the patients are actually in pain. Can you talk about how we can facilitate, raise awareness for the treatments that are available, as well as the disease?
Thank you, Heather. Yes, what you tell me is correct. Sickle cell disease is quite a devastating disease, and we have known about this disease for many, many years. In fact, this is the first disease that was sequenced at the molecular level. Yet, in terms of practical treatment, we haven't had hardly anything for decades and decades. And the first treatment that was developed was chemotherapeutic agents, and 20 years later, we were able to come up with the Endari. Now, we see sickle cell patients and we realize how devastating it is. And the first time I saw the patients suffering from sickle cell painful crisis or other complications, I was quite stunned because of severity of their symptoms and the suffering that patient had. And that kind of led me to really do something for sickle cell disease. Unfortunately, many people, including medical care providers, don't really know what sickle cell patients go through. So the most important thing is to increase awareness, which is education. Now, along with the education, what really moves people, what moves folks probably is financial incentive, fortunately or unfortunately. And I truly believe that developing good treatment is going to save money, government, insurance companies, and hospitals. And for example, our treatment Endari, with a relatively simple pharmacoeconomic analysis that we've done, we're able to significantly reduce hospitalization and also use of ICU, which obviously leads to financial incentive for the hospital and the insurance companies. And if we can let people realize these facts, I think there is going to be more enthusiasm. Now, in terms of education, we have to get this type of funding to help us reach out to care provider as well as to sickle cell community and then to general community. What we're doing at Emmaus right now is to reach out to some celebrities who have relationship with sickle cell disease. And we are going directly to the patients. And also, we're trying to raise funds so that we can go to medical centers or centers where sickle cell patients are treated frequently and hope to provide education to care providers because there are well-published treatment plans for sickle cell patients published by NIH. And somehow if that was taught at medical school level or in training level, we should be able to reduce the hospitalization of sickle cell patients by not just 50%, but more than 80%, how to deal with crisis. But we haven't been able to spread this news. So, and of course, to do this, we do need some funding, but also once people realize what this sickle cell disease is all about, I'm sure there'll be more enthusiasm.
So talking about funding, and Heather, I'll jump in for just a quick second. How challenging has it been to reach out to family offices and to reach out to private investors, accredited investors, to participate in a rare disease, especially one that is not prevalent in North America and in the US and Canada and in Northern Europe? Dr. Nair?
Oh, yes. So as Dr. Perrin said, for US, we have something called orphan drug designation, which gives a lot of incentives to pharmaceutical companies. And many of the big pharmaceutical companies are starting to take advantage of this since mid 2000s, around since 2006, 2007, and that's a good thing. So there are more research and more involvement of large pharmaceutical companies for this. However, there appears to be a disconnect between what really works for the patient versus what sounds interesting to I may not be saying this correctly, but to investors. And I think it is really important for us to really make a connection between what really works for the patient and which in long term is going to really help the investors. And this is just my thinking, but a lot of diseases where treatment was actually developed and society is benefiting is when there are groups of activists. For example, HIV, when HIV first came out in mid-1980s, and we start to understand this more and more, we thought that there was nothing we could do about this. But then most patients who were suffering from HIV were very intelligent, well-to-do, relatively young patients, and they got together and they pushed the researchers and government. And by 1992, 1993, we knew that this was some disease that we'll be able to control. And there are a few other rare diseases, something similar has happened. And for the rare diseases that can actually help the patients and the community, we may need activists. And this is just my view, my really personal view. Diseases that seem to suffer are the diseases where suffering populations are relatively weaker social economic class or weaker group of patients where they cannot really form what I call a benevolent activists.
Thank you. Okay, so Dr. Goetzman, every year, roughly 2,000 babies are born with sickle cell disease. It's the most common inherited blood disorder in the US. Your research has shown that younger, well-nourished, well-hydrated patients have a milder clinical course. How do we reach these patients and give them the support they need? I know there's been testing, but how do we raise awareness amongst these patients?
Thank you for that question. So, in the U.S. and in a lot of other countries, we utilize the newborn screen to be able to identify our patients with sickle cell disease. And oftentimes these patients are established with a sickle cell center and are able to get care. Some of the issues is that patients that have trait may not know, and then eventually, these patients may go on and have children with sickle cell and they'll never have awareness of their disease. So the newborn screen, at least in the United States, is trying to push efforts to get that information out. In countries that may not be utilizing these strategies, that's definitely a way to at least to be able to identify patients early on from birth who are affected with the disease. So we're able to treat them early on, because we know that early treatment and good follow-up early on in pediatrics will hopefully be able to get better care later on in adults, which is a whole other issue. But at least from the beginning, we need to be able to identify these patients from the very beginning with techniques as newborn screen.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Curran, what would promote the development of additional therapies for sickle cell disease?
Well, I think one simple thing that could promote more therapies is to extend and expand the pricing incentives for development of orphan therapies in general, because the process for developing a new therapy of either a medicine or a cell therapy is very long. So often a new therapy or a new therapeutic approach will reach clinical testing after 20 to 30 years in university laboratories. And so the actual discoverers may have filed a patent, which will only have a 20-year lifespan. So by the time a therapy reaches clinical testing, when one must evaluate how to give the drug, what kinds of doses are safe, establish all the safety concerns that the FDA or the EMA or the other regulatory agencies require. This is another 10 to 20-year process. It is said, or I have heard, that pharmaceutical products require a greater, more funding, more funds and more financing than any other type of industry. So if one could extend the orphan drug protection from 7 to 10 years to 20 or 30 years, that simple thing, I believe, could bring a huge difference in encouraging development, particularly of products that are called repurposed. To elaborate for a minute, the first drug developed for sickle cell disease was hydroxyurea, which today would be called a repurposed therapeutic. And that was developed solely by university investigators and the National Institutes of Health, and then confirmed by European investigators, and eventually now also provided by a company from Europe. But repurposed drugs take half the time or less, and maybe 20% of the cost of a brand new therapy. So I think expanding the protections, the market exclusivity, would make a huge difference in bringing more therapies to patients. It's a long, long process. Thank you for that question.
So, Dr. Nihara, how can we work with governments and agencies internationally to help treatment in populations where this is so prevalent, like India and Africa?
Yes, that is a very good and in a way a difficult question, because every country, the way they deal with their medical problems are not this different. And well, in our case, we are very fortunate because we were working with the Orphan Drug Office of FDA when I was first working with this product, and they gave me a lot of guidance, and they gave us designation. They even gave us funding to get to our goal of approval. When we go to more of developing countries or countries in between the developed countries and developing countries, there are different rules and different red tapes that we have to cross. So in my way or in our way, we just speak to a number of people who really understand what is necessary in these countries. What I found is that every regions that we worked with, Middle East, India, or Africa, the government officials are usually quite receptive. And it is a little bit of a challenge, but we have to really vet the consultants. There are many people who tell us that they can do a lot of things, but we have to really vet them and find the right consultants who really care for what we do. And of course, we're not asking them to do anything for free. And eventually there is going to be some gain, both for the government, patients, and people who help us. That's the hard part, but I think vetting the appropriate consultant or somebody who can guide you through the regulation of each region.
Yeah, from what I understand, you've made some inroads in the Middle East, you've made some inroads in India, you've made some inroads in Africa, and you've had positive experiences on the government side of it. Are you able to then attract investment from local markets? Are local family offices in the Middle East or in India even aware that this opportunity exists that would have a significant impact on communities, on their own communities? And the same goes to US investors. You know, we talk a lot about impact investing and we talk a lot about ESG, and it seems like developing and deploying a benign medication that has such efficacy would be a natural fit. Yet it seems like you seem to have trouble raising capital. Do you think it's because you're not reaching the right family offices, or is it that you feel that family offices are not receptive because they feel it's too small a market?
Thank you. Yeah, I think true to all of your statements, and yet there is also so like a hopeful part. For example, it took us 25 years to develop this Endari. And I really appreciate what Dr. Perrine has mentioned, because we got our patent in 1997, and in the year that we received the approval from the FDA, our patent expired. So it was really nice that we had orphan drug designation protection to go forward from there. But during that 25 years, I was able to raise, just from family and friends, $120 million. So there are a lot of people who really care about doing good things. And I also found that many of the family offices do care. Of course, we have to make sure that we have to give them a good return, or at least a positive return. Just within the last few years, I was introduced to many group of people who didn't really realize what sickle cell disease was all about and what our treatment can do to sickle cell patients. And I think as we be persistent with effort to reach out to these family offices or investors, I think we'll be able to raise money. I'm gaining confidence. Up to this point, probably we didn't have enough credential to really convince these investors in a big way, but we are starting to have some very nice positive data. I am very, very excited about what may happen over the next 5 years.
Thank you. So before we're about to wrap up, is there anything else you would like to say, Dr. Perrine? And then Dr. Coates.
I guess I would just like to say that this is a very exciting time for therapies for sickle cell disease, because a great many approaches are now reaching the clinic. And, you know, after, as we've said, 20 to 40 years of or more of university research, there are a number of promising therapies, both small molecule and cellular therapies. I'd like to say that sickle cell disease, I think, is an extremely important disease for all people everywhere, because all of those 500 million people with sickle cell trait helped us to survive the centuries when severe malaria was endemic, hyperendemic all over the earth, and that may come back. So this is a survival gene, and it's the patients who have 2 copies rather than 1 that are paying the price. But I think I don't know if people know that, but we owe all of these families with the sickle gene, thanks for helping mankind survive. And I think it's should not have the stigma and the isolation that it does. I also hope that there will be support for mental health and support programs for the patients, because There are many young people today who feel isolated and depressed, particularly after the COVID pandemic, and it's even more so for patients with sickle cell disease. Often those going to college or young adults trying to navigate the health insurance and the which is very complicated. And so some of the support programs that are being developed, like the Cayenne Wellness Program, all the sickle cell associations in different states and different countries, those are very important to help patients find the therapies that they need and know that they're not alone. No.
Thank you.
Thank you for having this.
And any parting words, Dr. Nihara or Dr. Goetzman?
Thank you, Dr. Perrine, and thank you again, Heather, and also Dr. Goetzman. Yes, our focus is with sickle cell disease, but this can be applied to many rare diseases or more common diseases too. I think if we put our efforts, some of the most devastating diseases can become a chronically manageable disease, just like HIV that became quite manageable disease today. Compared to when it was first discovered, it was totally deadly disease. And I truly believe, as bad as sickle cell disease is, if we can come up with something that we can, probably a combination therapy of some sort, something that's simple, something that can reach out to these remote regions in Africa, and patients can take this at home orally, but maybe combination of 2 or 3 effective medication. I truly believe that someday, maybe hopefully not too far in the future, we'll be able to make sickle cell disease a manageable disease that's going to benefit the patients, the family, the community, and the investors.
Thank you. Well, on that note, thank you so much. And we appreciate all the work that you guys have done and do to dedicate your lives to helping patients with this devastating disease and seeking treatment and raising awareness. Thank you.